WisconsinEye is on the campus of Gateway Tech in Sturtevant, interviewing candidates for the December 19th primary and the Democratic primary in Assembly District 66. John Tate II is one of those candidates. John, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for having me.
Why are you running in the special election in the 66th, Mike?
Well, I'd like to back up and just say why I even got into the politics in the first place.
Please.
For about 8 years, I worked in residential treatment in Illinois for a group home and actually various settings, with children with behavioral and developmental disabilities. And during that time, I worked in one of the group homes where we also transitioned some of the kids out into the adult system. And what I found was, although their diagnosis didn't change, although their family circumstances didn't change, the funding that was available certainly did. And it dropped off precipitously as they transitioned the systems. And I came to understand that that was a result of policy decisions and someone at a state level saying, you know, we're going to fund to this point, but we're not going to fund to this point. And I was compelled to want to be at that table and advocate for people who otherwise voice was being ignored. And what we often find is, you know, when it comes to budget cuts, the first thing to go is often human services. So without somebody who really intimately understands, you know, how human services work and just how critical it is in the lives of the people that we serve, you know, we're going to continue to see those things happen. So that's what compelled me to get into politics in the first place. And certainly at the state level, that's where we can have the most direct impact on those policies that affect people that I care about and that I work for.
You're trained as a social worker.
Yes, I'm a clinical social worker with a master's degree from Loyola University.
Your Facebook post, you talk about, in light of the controversy over Lincoln Hills, you talk about our prison industrial complex. So let me ask you, before we get to some of these other issues, should Lincoln Hills be closed, sir?
Well, I know there's a necessity to have a facility for youth who offend in a way that is egregious and requires them to be removed from society to a certain level so they can be fully rehabilitated. What we do know about Lincoln Hills, though, is that the services that are provided do not meet those needs to actually rehabilitate our youth. Essentially, it's a housing unit until they get to the adult system. And when I talk about the prison industrial complex, I'm talking about the school to prison pipeline and those sorts of things that say, you know, we'll identify a young black boy at 12 years old, and you know he'll be lacking all sorts of resources. He'll make a terrible decision, and then because he's made that terrible decision, we'll brand him as a criminal as opposed to a youth who needs help and support. And then we'll send him to this system that we say is supposed to rehabilitate, but has not the services to do that. And we're surprised when actually he gets out, he goes and offends again and ends up in the adult system, and now he's there for who knows how long because of truth in sentencing laws. So as far as whether Lincoln Hills should be closed, I mean, we need a facility, but we certainly know that Lincoln Hills is not, you know, meeting up to the standards that are required to actually serve our youth who've made terrible decisions, and we want to rehabilitate them back into society.
We're only a few miles from Mount Pleasant, where Foxconn proposes this huge manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
Had you had a chance, would you have voted for the Foxconn incentives package, sir?
So first, I want to kind of talk about the distinction that may exist between Representative and now Mayor Mason and I. I understand his positions. I understand his rationale. We've talked plenty about the whole Foxconn situation. Had I been the legislator at the time, because of the standards that were not met by, you know, the overall legislature, particularly those of my Democratic colleagues who expect a living wage, expect some actual protections for our environment, expect some real protections for our tax base and taxpayers. Without those things being there, I couldn't support the bill as it was. So I definitely would have voted no with the rest of my Democratic colleagues, but I definitely understand the rationale and the reasoning why Representative Mason would have made a different decision. And I don't want to go into the details of that, but I certainly would support his rationale for doing that. If I were in his position, though, exclusively as a legislator, I probably would not have made the same decision.
Cabinet Secretaries Neitzel and Hogan have said Foxconn will, and they've repeated this, offer an opportunity for the underemployed and unemployed in Racine, Milwaukee, and Kenosha counties. Do you believe their promises, sir?
Well, given that, you know, Walker and his administration have made a whole lot of promises, like 250,000 jobs in the state, it would be hard to bank on it now, 8 years into his tenure, that any of his administration would say that, you know, this thing's really going to happen, because it's been an abysmal failure in terms of meeting those policies and those promises for the last 7-8 years. You know, when we talk about we promise that there'll be opportunity, you know, it's one thing to say opportunity, it's another thing to say, here's how we're going to make that opportunity happen. So we have, you know, a whole lot of activists in the Racine area talking about we need to have a 20-20-20 standard, which means 20% of the jobs ought to go to the residents, 20% of the contracts ought to go to minority businesses, and 20% of the hours ought to go to apprentices. And that's what really creates opportunity. When we put it in paper to say, this is the standard that you have to meet, and if you don't meet that standard, then this is the financial penalty. But without those sort of things, those promises are just promises. And, you know, that might as well be hot air blowing in the wind.
Interstate 94 in Racine played a role in the funding, in the delay of passing the state budget.
Yeah.
But unresolved is how we pay for future highway
Right.
construction. Could you vote to raise the gas tax, the license plate renewal fee? Yeah. How do we pay for the state's highway
Right.
future?
Well, I think when we talk about the transportation system, we have to look at the broader, context that we're in. Governor Walker refused to accept some federal funding to allow us to have regional, well, actually, Speaker Voss kind of eliminated the possibility of regional transportation authorities, and Governor Walker refused the funding to actually have high-speed rail. So what we know about roads and highways and the interstate system is that it's very expensive. It's expensive to maintain, it's expensive to build, and it requires maintenance regularly. So these costs are going to keep going up if our only investment is into roads and roads for vehicle travel, when we have a whole lot of people in Wisconsin who commute, like period. I think we saw a report recently that said that, a good majority of folks who live in Milwaukee live outside of the Milwaukee County. So that means these folks are traveling via vehicle most of the time. Now imagine if we had a transportation system that could move hundreds of people at once without having to rebuild and reconstruct the roads that they're living on, like if we had a rail system that connects multiple municipalities, but we don't. So as it goes back to the gas tax though, or whatever, how we might pay for it, I mean, Wisconsin's gas tax has been, I think, stagnant for about nearly a decade. And while it's absolutely true that on average it's been higher than everywhere else in the state, I think it's been in the top 10 for probably at least a good number of a 20-year period if we look back at the study. But then the reality is we have roads that need repairing, and we have a revenue problem as it relates to our roads. So yes, raising the gas tax, let's say 3%, or 3 cents on the dollar, for maybe let's have a limited period so that we can cover the gaps that exist within our budget so we can actually get our roads up to snuff. What often people don't recognize, particularly in the city as an alderman, we get a lot of complaints about the roads and the conditions thereof. But folks think that's just strictly a city problem when the majority of the funds that we get for our roads in the city come from the DOT. And that means that whatever our options are, whatever our ability is significantly hampered by the Walker administration's choices to not fund the highway system, to not fund our road system, to not fund the DOT to the level that's required to really repair and take care of our roads so that our people can get around.
So you might vote for a 3-cent increase in the gas tax if you were in office?
I think it's definitely worthy of debate to get to where actually is the point that's effective for our community and for our state. But I think a gas tax wouldn't be an insane idea, and it wouldn't be unreasonable. Particularly, 3 cents on the dollar, and vehicles get much better gas mileage than they used to 10 years ago. So ultimately, the tax that we would have been receiving anyway is probably less because the taxes that people are paying are less because they're getting better mileage.
As an alder, has the city considered a wheel tax?
No, we haven't. I'm not sure whether state statute, I do know that a lot of state statutes kind of prohibit cities from being able to tax in various manners, but we have not considered a wheel tax recently. It's just not something that's really come up on the radar as far as how we maintain our roads. Really, more than anything, we'd like to be able to cooperate with the state. But it seems like at times the state overall has a lot of animosity towards the cities, and that's unfortunate.
What are your thoughts on how to fight the heroin and opioid epidemic, especially as a trained social worker, sir?
Yeah. Well, when we look at this situation, we have to recognize that it didn't come in a vacuum. And we understand that if we look at the broader scheme of what America's looked like, substances and substance abuse has been pretty pervasive throughout our existence. And the one concern that I have as we talk about the opioids is, we found so much mercy all of a sudden to see that, people who are abusing these drugs, they need help, they need treatment. But when the same thing was happening, but with a different drug, such as the crack epidemic in the 80s, burning through black and brown communities, we were so willing to throw these people in jail and say that's their personal problem and forget the treatment aspect of it. So I'm glad that we're finally coming around. It's unfortunate that it took, opioids and, drugs to have to burn through majority white communities before we did it, but I'm glad we're there. As far as addressing the problem, really when we talk about drug abuse, it's really getting down to despair that people are in and they can't find a way out. So it's a much broader than just dealing with the drugs themselves, but it's dealing with the circumstances that draw a person to wanting to use. And that's really, economic anxiety a lot of times. If somebody's not able to work and not able to provide their family, they're going to probably find a way to relieve that stress and that anxiety, whether it's use of alcohol, which is, we have a problem with drinking in Wisconsin anyway, whether it's illicit substances, whether it's marijuana, and we're locking up people for using something that ultimately doesn't even belong in the Schedule 1 if we look at the research. But we really need to deal with the root causes of why people are struggling. And And economic anxiety, I think, plays a significant role in that, as well as just worry about what the future is going to hold. We just have so much uncertainty, and it's not a surprise that people would turn to something that kind of just reduces the worry and the stress of that uncertainty that exists, as whether it's from the federal government, whether it's from the state government, or whether it's from our just employment sector and not knowing where the next paycheck's going to come from. I think I've seen statistics that 66% or something like that of American families cannot survive a $500 emergency. I mean, if I know that experience because I've lived it throughout my life. Fortunately, I've had support systems that have been able to kind of raise me up and help me through those situations. But I couldn't imagine, being on my own in an island and saying I can't make it. If I get a fender bender, now I have to pay for that, and we're probably not going to eat next week because we have to get the car fixed because we have to get to work. So that's terrifying, and to understand that terror that people experience just living is really important. It is necessary to have a representative that really understands that experience too, so that we can make policies that are completely people-oriented and we don't lose sight of people when we're talking about numbers and statistics, because we're talking about people.
You mentioned alcohol. There's a bill in the Assembly that would lower the drinking age to 19 if we didn't lose $53 million in federal highway aid.
Right.
Your position on that, sir?
That's a tough one. For me, I understand there's multiple aspects to it. One of my thoughts is, if a person at 18 years old is wise enough to go into the military and essentially potentially sacrifice their life for the service of our country, it's hard to imagine why we would have barriers in place for them being able to consume substances. On the flip side, I know that the child's brain doesn't stop developing until 26 years old or so, actually 22, 23, 24, 25. And alcohol can have a significant impact as executive functioning is developing. So not even looking at the economic side of it of we'll lose revenue if we drop the age, there's a whole lot of other things that we need to be understanding about what drinking does to the brain, what choices we allow certain age groups to make, and whether they are consistent in terms of our philosophy. So I mean that's much more complex than just we'll lose funding if we lower the age. And I think it's really necessary that we have those much more complex conversations separate from dollars and cents and more about society and culture, so that we can really make policies that really reflect the values of our culture and really understand the reality of people and how we function within those systems.
You couldn't vote today to lower the age?
No.
Okay. There are bills in the legislature dealing with what's called the dark store phenomenon. Mm-hmm. This is where judges have ordered that the values of closed large retailers be lowered, and there's a whole issue about whether that's fair. Mm-hmm. Your position on the dark store controversy?
Well, I mean, as a municipal legislator, I recognize the lost tax revenue that occurs when these large buildings that have value, whether or not they're operating or not, how it impacts our overall tax base. Because what really happens is we have these large entities with these large buildings who have inherent value, but if they're paying lower, then ultimately that tax burden falls onto the residences mm-hmm. and their home properties. And I know in Racine that is a significant problem for a lot of people. When I go to door and ask folks, like, what are your concerns? Like, during this particular election, taxes have come up more than anything. And these are property owners who lived in Racine for a long time and recognize that the numbers keep seemingly going up, but I'm not seeing the return in terms of what that's paying for. And part of that probably is because we're not getting the revenue from the places that we should be, which is these large retail stores kind of finding this loophole around paying their fair share in taxes. And that's something that we need to address overall. There's a lot of disparity as it relates to fair share in taxes across this country, but particularly in Wisconsin. And if we're not putting people first as the primary focus of how do we pay taxes in an equitable way, then we're probably going to continue to have situations where corporations, who in my mind are not people, will continue to have an advantage.
There's a bill that could come up for a vote next year that would ban the research on fetal tissue from elective abortions. Your position, sir?
Well, I think it's important to do research, to help our medical providers and find innovative ways to deal with diseases that have been ravaging humanity for centuries. Because they're elective abortions, that means that this person is making a choice to do that thing. So at the most, there should just be a checkbox to say that if you're okay with this being used for that purpose. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's the government's place or the state legislature's place to step in and say this can't be used for that purpose simply because fill in the blank what position you have or what line or what side of the spectrum you're on as it relates to abortion.
In the state budget passed in 2013, it started a voucher, a choice program in the city of Racine.
Yeah.
Now that you're an alder, you've had a
Yep.
few years to look at that. What's your position on choice, the voucher program?
As far as choice, I'm all for parents having an opportunity to choose what school their children go to. My concern is whether these schools are held to the same standards as the public schools. And when they're not, it seems unfair to say that we're going to take public money, give it to a private entity, and then not hold them to the same standards as an entity that has to take every student, no matter how they perform, no matter how they behave. What we often see is, with these voucher schools is when headcount comes, there's a whole lot of kids who get kicked back to the school district. But for whatever reason, our legislature says that once that headcount happens, the funds that went with those students stay, whether the student stays or not, for the duration of the year. And that's a problem, because what that really does is create higher needs in the public schools with fewer resources, and then we're surprised when some of our schools really struggle because they have more problems to deal with, but less money to solve the problems with. So that's a concern. So again, I'm all for parents being able to choose, but I'm also really for schools being held accountable and being held to a similar standard, especially if they're all going to get public funds.
So if you're in the assembly, would you vote to freeze the choice program in your city, or vote to get rid of it, repeal it?
At this point, I know there are some schools in Racine that are doing very well. 21st Century is a fantastic voucher school. I also know that probably the majority of non-public schools in Racine are surviving. I wouldn't say majority, but a good portion of non-public schools in Racine are surviving strictly due to the voucher system. A report came out that said St. Cat's High School is about 70% voucher students. So without those vouchers, St. Cat's wouldn't exist. So I would probably be in support of freezing the program until we kind of reassess, the actual merits of voucher schools, as well as to ensure that the standards that exist are being fair across the board. Because really, if you're getting public funds, you ought to have to be held to the same standards as our public schools. And that's just a simple fact. And if they don't have those same standards, then they shouldn't be getting public funds.
When Alderman Miegman endorsed you, he said one reason he endorsed you was your vision of inclusion.
Yeah.
Is race an issue in this race?
Race is an issue in every race, whether we say it or not, because it's going to come to the surface, and we can't really talk about anything that's happening in Wisconsin, in Racine, or in America separate from race. It is our original sin that we've created a race disparity in the United States, whether it's about our Native American brothers and sisters who we committed genocide upon as Americans transitioned to this country, whether it's my black brothers and sisters who were enslaved in this country, what we're currently doing with our Latino brothers and sisters who are just trying to achieve the American dream, and we're demonizing them in multiple levels of government for simply trying to achieve a dream that each of us all want to pursue. So yes, race absolutely is an issue, particularly right now in Racine, because we were recently identified as the 4th worst place in America for black Americans. If we're not talking about that, we're not really talking about anything. And we're definitely not talking about the issues that affect my constituency and my people, ultimately. So yes, race is an issue. And I think at this point, Racine deserves representation that understands the intimate reality of race. We often talk about white privilege, but we don't talk about white supremacy. And you don't have to be racist to be a proponent of white supremacy. All you have to do is have privilege and a position and influence. And if you use that to your advantage, ultimately what you're doing is you're perpetuating white supremacy, whether you intend to or not. Similar to our state legislature with that OSPP legislation that authorizes surrounding municipalities to separate from the school district and take over of the school district by the county. What that really does is creates, or would have the potential to create, a majority white school district that has more money and a majority minority school district that has less money. Whether you are racist or not, that is the ultimate intention, or that's the ultimate outcome of that sort of legislation. So if we're not really talking about race, then we're not really talking about reality in Racine, in Wisconsin, and the United States.
Okay, 2 final questions. One of them, your opponent has said, in light of allegations of misconduct that surfaced last week, Representative Josh Zebnik should resign.
Yeah.
Do you have a position on that, sir?
Yes, I think he should resign too. And the reason is this. As Democrats, it is important that we speak with one voice when there are issues that affect a significant portion of our constituency. Democrats stand for women. Democrats stand for African Americans. Democrats stand for Latinos. Democrats stand for everybody who is otherwise left behind. And if at this time we don't come together as a party and say, we're not going to stand for sexual assault, we're not going to stand for, toxic masculinity. We're not going to stand for the patriarchy or misogyny existing amongst people who are supposed to represent our party and elected officials. That has to be our position. As the Me Too movement kind of grows and women are empowered to speak out about the things they experience, it is absolutely imperative that those of us who intend to represent any group of people stand with those who are vulnerable and stand with those who are having their voices finally come to the forefront.
And then finally, do you want to highlight any differences between you and your opponent?
Yeah. There are going to be a ton of similarities between Ms. Neubauer and myself. We are both very progressive, young leaders who want to make a difference in our community. The biggest difference right now that I would say in this race is representation. And because I live, love, and experience Racine in probably a way that Ms. Neubauer hasn't, that is a significant difference. I'm a social worker. I've worked in human services for over a decade now. And that experience has allowed me to understand intimately the challenges that people experience, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're male, whether you're female, or anything in between. And that is so important right now, as we have so many challenges happening in the country, so many social struggles that are finally getting the voice that they recognize. It is important to have a representative in Racine that intimately understands those things. I've worked with transgender students. I've worked with them as they've tried to figure out, who they want to be, who they think they are, and how do they speak their truth into the world. I've worked with traditional and non-traditional families, grandparents who've had to take on their children because of opioid and drug abuse issues or criminal activities from their parents, and helping them figure out, well, this is this very different generation than maybe the children you raised. How do you bridge that gap so you can support that child? I've worked with single mothers and single parents, and the multiple experiences that so many people have in Racine. Having family members incarcerated and understanding how that system works and how they can be advocated for and have their voices lifted up so that they can get their family back, and that we can change the systems so that it doesn't grind up black and brown people the way it does, and that justice can actually be equitable. That is the biggest difference between Ms. Neubauer and myself, is the experience that I've lived, the experience that I've worked, is the experience that needs to be magnified and lifted up and amplified on the assembly floor. And that's what I want to do for the city of Racine.
Thank you. John Tate II is a Democratic candidate in the December 19th primary in Assembly District 66. John, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.